I now want to introduce our last speaker, Commissioner Khatija Thomas. Khatija is Co-Commissioner for Aboriginal Engagement in South Australia, and prior to this appointment she was a solicitor with the South Australian Native Title Services. Khatija completed a 12-month Australian Youth Ambassador for Development placement as a legal advisor at the Community Legal Education Centre in Cambodia. Her work was primarily in the Land and Natural Resources team on Indigenous land titling, land law and natural resources law issues. She is a member of the Law Society of South Australia's Indigenous Issues Committee and is currently enrolled in a Master of Public and International Law through the University of Melbourne, and is going to speak to us today on the issue of sovereignty and the letters patent. Please welcome Commissioner Khatija Thomas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Lynn. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And as a Kugala woman, thank you for having me on your country. Also pay my respects to my beautiful mother in the room. Hi, Mum. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her support and inspiration either. I suppose it's a hard act to follow all these amazing speakers here today, and it is such an honour to be sharing this panel with these people who have been as one of my heroes since I was 15. I chose to go to Flinders Uni because of him. And so I suppose I don't want to spend too much time talking about details of the legal side of things. I'm a lawyer, but now as a commissioner we spend a lot of time engaging with the state government and promoting dialogue between the Aboriginal community in South Australia. So I wanted to focus a little bit on issues that are practical and pertinent to us here as traditional owners in the state of South Australia. There's so many points that I want to touch on from what the other speakers have said, and one of those is that we haven't had a lot of discussion about here in South Australia as far as the federal constitution, recognition in the federal constitution goes, was the fourth point made by Lauren about a framework for recognition and a meaningful treaty, and well, people don't use treaty anymore, it's become a bit of a dirty word, but agreement making frameworks is the other way of coining the same concept. So that's something that I don't think we've talked about a lot here in South Australia in terms of the federal constitution, but it's something that comes up often in South Australia in relation to our history of colonisation, our letters patent, and recognition in our state constitution. And so the point I wanted to raise for discussion today with you all is about what we should be looking at as well for recognition in our state constitution, and how that can also relate to recognition in our federal constitution. I suppose I should talk a little bit about the letters patent, and something that that makes us unique as a state compared to other, the history of the colonisation of other states, is that our letters patent, which is the letter that authorised the colonisers when they came here with the laws and the structure and the governance. So it's really the start of the trunk of that tree when the English arrived in South Australia. Those instructions that were given to the colonisers actually expressly state that they were to negotiate on just terms with the native people here. Now, some people might say, we've had terra nullius here in Australia, Australia being considered terra nullius, so therefore that being an excuse as to why the colonisers didn't negotiate with us, because they didn't recognise us. However, since Mabo in 1992, where the myth of terra nullius was actually dispelled, that's no longer the case. And we have been recognised as the First Peoples and the First Nations of this country. And this is something that is still unfinished business for us here in South Australia. So I would say again, when we were talking about the foundations of our constitution, that it's not, as far as our sovereignty and our unceded sovereignty and right to this land goes, it has something that we've never had the conversation, the government never spoke to us about, the colonising commissioners never spoke to us as Aboriginal people about. And in a lot of ways, I see our constitution, as the state and the federal constitution, as fundamentally flawed on that basis, because they were told to enter into treaties with us, and it's something that never happened. So that is something I propose. It's not even about modernising our constitution, it's really about making the constitution correct. It's never actually been, well, it's always been fundamentally flawed in my eyes. And I suppose, again, we look at other countries for how that could be done. And the 4 countries that most people look at are the ones that we share a similar colonial history with: United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia is in that 4 groups of similar colonial history, because the country in which their laws came from and their colonisers came from is the same. Now, as far as treaties go, all those countries have treaties except for us, and they all have constitutional recognition as well except for us. And one of the things that I think we can learn a lot from, the countries we can learn a lot from, is the Canadian experience with treaty making. There's also a state there that in British Columbia that was colonised at a similar time to South Australia. So the international law politics as well, which is something that I'm interested in, that were happening globally about the law of, the doctrine of discovery it's called, the law around how you go about colonising countries, was really at that point in time focusing more on terra nullius than on the need to enter into treaties. And in Canada, they have recently, in the last couple of years, entered into, finally, a treaty with that state. So it goes to show that even hundreds of years after colonisation, governments can still show the political will to enter into treaties with Indigenous nations and their descendants. And that's an important point to make about our letters patent as well. It does mention the need to recognise the proprietary rights and sovereign rights of the Indigenous people and their descendants. So that keeps those instructions to the colony alive today. So I suppose on that note, my time's probably, is my time close to finishing now?
Speak as long as you want to.
Oh, okay. The only thing I would say is the example from that is in the Canadian Constitution, the recognition is affirming the rights, and I think, was it Robin or Irabina who mentioned affirming the rights of Aboriginal people as they exist today and to enter into treaties. And I see that something as, if we had that in our federal constitution, could work very well in terms of a framework for negotiating in South Australia, to bolster that for a recognition in our state constitution around authorising the people of South Australia, authorising the government of South Australia to enter into nation to nation, sovereign British nation or Australian nation, to sovereign language group, whether you're the sovereign people Ghana, the sovereign Kuguta people, sovereign Ngarrindjeri people, to actually enter into those agreements at a state and federal level at the table with Aboriginal people. And so that's something that I hope that we could achieve in a proactive way. Besides equality, when we look at our rights to land, what attaches to land for us is our right to self-government, our right to make decisions about our laws and our language, and how we choose to live our lives. So I see those things as all, in a practical sense, what is wrapped up in this ability to negotiate nation to nation, and the opportunity that this debate actually presents to us in South Australia and federally. So thank you. I look forward to having more discussions with you about that.
Thank you very much indeed, Khatija, and I particularly appreciate your raising before us the issue of the letters patent. I mentioned before that the Constitution has been something of a line in the sand, drawn by colonisers to say that all that happened before is of no account. This is the starting point, and therefore everything has to be justified and done within this framework. Yet in fact the letters patent were a kind of proto-constitution, and what happened since that time has been basically a fraud by the governments of South Australia in refusing to acknowledge these letters patent that were given to them as their instructions as the colonisers. So it's very pertinent for us in South Australia that we actually had a very good starting proposition from the colonisation point of view that sought to define in a fairer way, even if not absolutely fair, but a fairer way than had otherwise been the case. I mentioned this at when I was speaking in introducing the Paul Keating at the Louisa O'Donoghue oration. And I have to say I was very concerned that a senior member of the South Australian Cabinet told me afterwards that he found my comments very unhelpful in raising the issue of the letters patent. I'm sorry that that is the attitude, and I hope there might be a change of heart on the part of the government with respect to the letters patent. There were many things that we can also cite. The 1858 Pastoral Act, for example, also had recognition, effectively native title recognition, way before the Mabo Court decision. Thank you also for sharing the British Columbia example. The Nisga'a Treaty of British Columbia is a very, very significant process for us, because it is also after a long period of inaction or counteraction, and then some determined discussion by the First Nations peoples of British Columbia, determined not to just accept the ongoing status quo, but to change it. And then finally to have the legislature of that province come the journey. And why? Because the people of that province came the journey, and the Nisga'a Treaty is a result of that. And as you say, it's only just in the last 2 to 3 years really reached that stage. I was in this conference in West Australia, and we had Glenn Kelly from the Nyunga people from the Southwest Land Council of West Australia. And he was talking about legislation in other parts of the world, and he talked about the 1970 Alaska legislation that was amazingly advanced legislation in terms of really recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, First Nations people there. I found it very disconcerting to know that the president of the time who pushed that very hard was none other than Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon. But this was 41 years ago that much recognition was being given, and we're still looking at the issue now.